It started as a quiet funeral. Crisp uniforms, folded flags, a widow clutching a child to her chest. A canine dog sitting obediently at the foot of a mahogany coffin. And then, he barked. One bark. Then another. Louder, angrier. It cut through the priest's prayer like a knife. People turned, some startled, others irritated. The dog's name was Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd with over 50 successful police operations under his belt. He wasn't just any canine, he was Officer Thomas Hall's partner, and Hall was the man lying in the coffin, or so everyone thought. At first, folks tried to ignore it. "He's grieving," someone whispered. "It's his way of saying goodbye." But Ranger didn't just bark. He growled. He scratched at the base of the casket. His nails screeched against the polished wood, and his handler struggled to pull him back. Something was wrong. Horribly wrong. They were standing in Spring Creek Memorial, a small cemetery in upstate New York. A storm had just passed, leaving the air sticky with the smell of wet grass and pine needles. Officer Hall had supposedly died in the line of duty, an off-duty traffic accident, according to the department. No suspicious circumstances, no further questions, but Ranger hadn't been there that night. That alone was strange. He and Hall were inseparable. Where Hall went, Ranger followed. Period. Still, most people chalked it up to a horrible accident. Tragedy happens. Life moves on. Except Ranger wouldn't let it. When the priest resumed the service, Ranger yanked hard on his leash, nearly dragging his handler across the grass. The guests murmured again, this time louder. An elderly woman dropped her prayer book. The widow, Hall's wife Marissa, looked around in confusion. Even she seemed unsure what to make of it. That's when Lieutenant Greg Harmon, a close friend of Hall's, stepped forward. He had seen dogs react to gunfire, bombs, even corpses. But this was different. Ranger wasn't scared. He wasn't sad. He was desperate. Harmon knelt next to Ranger, looking him straight in the eyes. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Ranger whined, then barked again, short, sharp, insistent. He pawed at the coffin's left corner. Harmon stood slowly. He looked at the priest, then at the widow. "I want this casket opened," he said. A gasp rippled through the mourners. "You can't do that," a man shouted from the crowd. "This is a funeral, not a circus." But Harmon wasn't asking. He was giving a direct order. The coffin would be opened, right now. If you're gripped by stories of animal heroes and shocking truths, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Heroes for Animals, and never miss the next unbelievable tale. As the funeral director approached with hesitant hands, Marissa finally stepped forward. Her eyes were red, mascara running slightly from tears, but her voice was steady. "Why?" she asked. "Why open it now?" Harmon didn't look away. "Because Ranger says something's not right, and I trust him." It took another minute to get permission. The casket was unsealed. The director carefully lifted the lid, slowly, as if afraid of what might be inside. The room, or rather, the entire cemetery, fell silent. Not a bird chirped. Not a single breath was taken. Then came the sound, a sound nobody expected. Ranger growled, low, guttural, primal. Harmon leaned over the edge of the open casket and froze. The body inside was wearing Officer Hall's uniform, badge, name tag, medals. Everything appeared correct. But Harmon spotted it instantly. The hands, they were clean. Too clean. Hall had calluses from years on the job, a scar from a knife fight on the pinky, a missing fingernail from an ATV crash. This man had perfect hands. Harmon ordered the body photographed, the prints taken. Something felt horribly off. Meanwhile, Ranger sat beside the open casket, head low, growling continuously. His instincts told him this wasn't the man he had loved and served with, and he was right. The prints came back 2 hours later. The man in the coffin wasn't Officer Thomas Hall. Panic set in at the station. What had started as a respectful goodbye had now turned into a full-blown internal investigation. Ranger was temporarily moved to a quiet kennel at the station, but he didn't rest. He paced. He barked at the door. He refused food. He wanted back in the field. Over the next 24 hours, detectives scoured the records. Officer Hall's last known location, a gas station on Route 17. He was supposed to be driving to his brother's cabin upstate. No witnesses saw him afterward. His phone? Disconnected. His credit cards? Inactive. His car? Missing. But then, one blurry security cam footage surfaced. From a small-town pharmacy 60 miles away, a figure, slumped weak, looked a lot like Hall, being forced into a white van by 2 masked men. Marissa Hall, the widow, was brought in again, this time with questions. "When did you last hear from your husband?" Harmon asked gently. She hesitated. "About 4 days before they said he died." She wrung her hands. "He'd been acting different, nervous. Said he found something bad, and that he didn't know who he could trust, even in the department." Harmon's heart sank. Officer Thomas Hall had been onto something, and someone wanted him silenced. Back at the station, Ranger was brought into a lineup of objects taken from the supposed crash scene. He ignored all of them, except one, a blood-stained uniform collar that had been discarded far from the original site. Ranger sat, barked once. They had something, but they needed more time. Time Officer Hall might not have. The fake funeral had shattered everyone. In just a matter of hours, the man buried with full honors was revealed to be a stranger. And the officer who was supposed to be in that casket, Thomas Hall, was now listed as a missing person. No one said it aloud, but every cop at Spring Creek Memorial was thinking the same thing. If it weren't for Ranger, we'd have buried a lie. At the station, Lieutenant, Greg Harmon took control of the investigation. He knew the clock was ticking. If Hall was still alive, and that was a big if, he had less than 48 hours before he disappeared for good. The state police were notified. A bolo went out for a white utility van seen in the pharmacy footage. They cross-referenced toll booth activity, but no license plate had been captured. The van had no decals, no markings. It could have belonged to any contractor, plumber, or delivery driver. Harmon replayed the footage again and again. The man being dragged into the van had the same build as Hall, same gait. But his face was mostly obscured. He paused the video, on a single frame, just before the van door slammed shut. There, under the dim yellow light of the parking lot, was Ranger, caught in the reflection of the pharmacy window, standing, watching. Hall must have gotten away briefly, just long enough for Ranger to see him. The department was split. Some thought Hall had run, faked his own death. Maybe he was involved in something dark, something criminal, but Harmon refused to believe that. "You don't fake your own death with your dog still in service," he said flatly. "You don't do that to your partner." Ranger was restless again. He wouldn't sleep, wouldn't settle. Every time a door opened, he turned his head sharply. Every time a car drove by, he rose to attention. He was waiting for Hall. By the second night, the trail was cold. Harmon made the call to bring in Ranger for a field search. They needed boots and paws on the ground. They started at the gas station where Hall had last fueled up. Ranger was released from his harness. Nose to the ground, he moved fast, down the edge of the lot, past the dumpsters, toward a patch of overgrown trees. Suddenly, he stopped, then growled. A torn glove lay half buried in the dirt. Inside it, a familiar scent. Lab tests would later confirm it carried Hall's DNA. Ranger had found their first real lead. By morning, a larger team joined the search. Bloodhounds, drones, state police. But the one dog everyone followed was Ranger. He moved with purpose through a wooded ravine just east of town. After nearly a mile, he paused near a creek bed, then barked furiously. There, soaked and tangled in brush, was a piece of fabric, a sleeve from a police windbreaker. Another positive. DNA match. Hall had been here, injured, likely on foot, but alive. It was now day 3. That afternoon, Harmon got a call from an unlikely source. A retired dispatcher named Sally Kendrick. She had seen the story on the news. "Lieutenant," she said, "you need to check the old lodge on Route 15, the one the department used for retreats back in the 80s. Harmon paused. "It's been abandoned for years." "Exactly," she said, "and only a few people would remember it exists." It was a long shot, but they had nothing else. The team rolled out within the hour. 3 SUVs, tactical gear. Ranger rode in the front, eyes locked on the window like he knew where they were going. The lodge was deep in the woods, surrounded by rusted fencing and blackberry thorns. One window was busted, the front door chained shut from the inside. But Ranger didn't hesitate. He leapt from the vehicle and sprinted around the side of the building toward the back basement door, and he barked one sharp, explosive bark, then another. The team broke down the back entrance. Inside, the air was damp and sour. Old drywall, mold, something else. They moved room by room, guns drawn, flashlights scanning broken furniture and torn insulation. Then they heard it. A faint knock. Once, twice. They followed the sound to a small pantry door near the kitchen. Behind it, Thomas Hall. He was barely conscious. Duct tape across his mouth, hands zip-tied, clothes tattered, but he was alive, and the first thing he saw was Ranger. The dog lunged forward, whining, licking Hall's face. The officers cut him loose, carried him to safety. Hall could barely speak, but he whispered the words through cracked lips. "They tried to kill me, because I found out what they were hiding." Back at the hospital, Hall began to recover slowly. And with him, so did the story. He'd uncovered a smuggling ring operating out of the evidence locker. Drugs, guns, cash, all disappearing under the radar. He reported it to a superior. 2 days later, he was followed, then ambushed, kidnapped. Left to die in a sealed room with no phone, no water, and no food. "They were going to bury someone else in my place," he said. "They wanted to make sure I never came back." If it hadn't been for Ranger, no one would have questioned the body in the coffin. No one would have found the truth. The arrests came quickly. 3 officers and a civilian clerk were charged. 2 others turned in their badges and disappeared. Internal affairs took over the department, but out of all the headlines, one name rose above the rest. Ranger, the dog who saved his partner, the dog who stopped a funeral, the dog who refused to let evil win. Weeks later, in front of City Hall, a bronze statue was unveiled. Ranger in mid-bark, paw lifted, muscles tense. Officer Hall stood beside it, cane in hand, Ranger at his feet. "I was almost erased," he told the crowd, but Ranger never gave up. He reminded all of us that loyalty doesn't stop when we're gone. Sometimes it starts the moment we're lost. 3 weeks had passed since the day Ranger barked at the coffin. 3 weeks since the world learned that Officer Thomas Hall had not died in a traffic accident. 3 weeks since Ranger had revealed the truth that saved a man's life, and unmasked a conspiracy buried deep within the heart of law enforcement. And in that time, everything had changed. The small town of Brookwood, New York, became the center of a national storm. Reporters camped outside the hospital where Hall was recovering. Helicopters buzzed over the once quiet police station. News vans took over downtown like it was Hollywood Boulevard. The public wasn't just curious. They were furious. How could a decorated officer go missing and no one notice? Why? Did a dog have to be the one to sound the alarm? Who's really running our justice system? It wasn't just a local scandal anymore. It was a national reckoning. And through it all, Ranger stayed by Hall's side. In the hospital room, Ranger lay curled near Hall's bed, alert to every sound. Nurses had to step gently around him. He wouldn't move unless Hall gave the command. One night around 2 a.m., Hall reached out and placed a weak hand on Ranger's back. "You saved me, buddy," he whispered. "You were the only one who didn't give up." Ranger thumped his tail once, then licked Hall's hand. Back at the department, sweeping changes were underway. Internal Affairs suspended 4 officers who had been connected to the smuggling ring. 2 pled guilty. The others were awaiting trial. The mayor called for an independent ethics board. The chief of police resigned for health reasons. And for the first time in the town's history, a civilian committee was given oversight over all evidence handling procedures. But the public wanted more than policy. They wanted justice. And at the heart of it all, they wanted to know more about the dog who started it. Soon, Ranger was everywhere. CNN ran a segment titled, "The Bark That Saved a Life." People magazine ran a photo of Ranger with Hall's arm. Around him, under the headline, "Not all heroes wear badges, some wear collars." Children sent handwritten letters to the department. "Dear Ranger, I love you. You are a good boy, I want to be like you." A retired Marine sent a Purple Heart tag for Ranger's collar. "He's a soldier in every way that matters," the note read. Then came the day the governor called. He wanted to honor Ranger at the state capitol. It was a full house event. Politicians, veterans, kids, police dogs from other counties. Ranger walked onto the stage next to Hall, who now used a cane and wore a brace around his torso. As the audience stood and clapped, Hall leaned down and whispered to Ranger, "You deserve this more than I ever will." When the applause died down, Hall took the microphone. "My dog didn't just save my life, he saved our department. He saved this town from forgetting what honor looks like. Ranger never quit on me, and he forced all of you to look deeper. Ask harder questions and demand better answers. This dog barked at a lie and wouldn't stop until the truth was set free." The room was silent. Then someone shouted, "To Ranger!" The crowd erupted. Back home, Hall slowly returned to his old routine, though nothing about his life was old anymore. He spent most mornings on the porch, coffee in hand, Ranger lying at his feet. Reporters still called. Offers came in for book deals, documentaries, even a Hollywood script. Hall turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in healing and in justice. But not everyone was ready to let the past go. One afternoon, Hall received an anonymous envelope. No return address. Inside, a photo of the basement he'd been kept in. On the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Next time, your dog won't be there." Hall didn't show it to anyone, not even the department, but Ranger must have sensed. That night he sat by the door wide awake, eyes locked on the darkened yard beyond the porch light. Meanwhile, something remarkable began to unfold across the country. Departments from Texas to Ohio began reviewing unsolved cases where K-9 units had alerted to suspicious activity, but were ignored. A detective in Oregon reopened a missing persons case after his K-9 refused to leave a storage shed during a routine inspection. What they found inside made national headlines. The Ranger effect had gone viral. Dog handlers everywhere were reminded that sometimes instinct speaks louder than rank. Back in Brookwood, the department officially renamed its K-9 training facility, the Ranger Tactical Center. At the dedication, the new chief of police stood in full uniform, flanked by every working dog in the region. "This building stands not just for bravery," he said, "but for accountability. And it bears the name of a dog who barked when others stayed silent." Ranger barked once in response. The crowd laughed and clapped, cameras flashed, and for a moment it felt like the world had tilted back toward something right. But the scars remained. Hall continued physical therapy. Nightmares were frequent. He often woke drenched in sweat, gasping, hand instinctively reaching for the gun he no longer carried. One evening during a power outage, Hall froze in the hallway, convinced he heard chains rattling, but it was only the wind. Ranger was there, pressing gently against his leg, grounding him. No words, just presence. That was enough. Later that week, Hall took Ranger to the local elementary school for career day. When it was their turn to present, Hall didn't talk about kidnappers or corrupt cops. He told the kids about what loyalty looks like, what it means to trust someone who can't talk, but never lies. How bravery doesn't always look like charging into gunfire. Sometimes it looks like a dog refusing to walk away from a box no one wants to open. One little girl raised her hand. Did Ranger cry when he thought you were gone? Hall knelt beside Ranger and nodded. I think he did, in his own way. But then he did something, stronger than crying. He acted. The story of Ranger was no longer just a news cycle. It had become something deeper, a reminder, a challenge. What if we all listened a little more to those who can't speak but still know the truth? What if we refuse to let go of someone just because the world tells us it's over? What if we barked at the coffin even when it makes people uncomfortable? Ranger did. And in doing so, he reminded a nation that courage doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a leash. Justice, it turns out, is rarely quiet. Once Officer Thomas Hall was rescued, once the smuggling ring was exposed and Ranger was hailed as a national hero, many thought the hardest part was over. They were wrong. The true test was just beginning. 3 men stood trial that fall. 2 corrupt officers from Brookwood's own department and a civilian evidence clerk named Jeremy Crane. Each was charged with conspiracy, obstruction, kidnapping, and attempted murder. The courtroom was packed. Local residents filled every bench. Press lined the back. Armed security stood along the walls. And at the very front, on Hall's left, sat Ranger, his K9 badge freshly polished and clipped to his vest. He wasn't just there for show. He was there to remind the world. I saw what you did. I remember. Hall took the stand on the 3rd day. He testified about the night he was abducted, how he was followed after reporting anomalies in the evidence logs, how his own car was hacked to disable the brakes, and how he was dragged from a rest stop parking lot and locked in a basement to rot. He described in painful detail the beatings, the threats, the chilling moment when one of the officers leaned in and said, "No one will miss you, they'll just bury the badge and salute." But they hadn't counted on the dog. The defense tried to poke holes. They claimed Hall had gone rogue, that he'd disappeared on his own only to return and fabricate a story. They questioned his injuries, his memory, his motives. But every time the prosecution brought out physical evidence, photos, DNA matches, security footage, Ranger would quietly growl, almost as if reinforcing the truth with his presence. He wasn't trained for courtrooms, but in that moment he held the room like a witness with no words, just unwavering loyalty. The verdict came on the 14th day, guilty, on all counts. Sentencing would follow weeks later, but the courtroom erupted in quiet. Relief. Justice, slow and fragile, had arrived. Ranger wagged his tail once. Hall didn't smile. He only nodded, his eyes glassy, a single tear slipping down his cheek. It was over, or so he thought. 2 nights after the trial, Hall's home security system triggered at 3:18 a.m. A shadow moved past his back porch. Another passed under the window. Ranger was already at the door, hackles raised, ears up. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. Hall grabbed his phone, alerting the local sheriff, before stepping out onto the porch, sidearm in hand, now legally returned after his recovery. But the intruders were gone. Nothing taken, no signs of forced entry, just one thing left behind, a butcher's bone, clean, fresh, placed at the foot of Ranger's outdoor water bowl. The next morning a message arrived by mail. No return address, just a torn piece of paper. You took down the wrong people. The ones who gave the orders are still out there. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was unfinished business. Hall considered leaving Brookwood, buying land upstate, vanishing into the mountains where no one could find him. But then he'd look at Ranger, calm, alert, always watching, and he'd shake his head. No. Running wasn't the answer. Finishing it was. He reached out to his old FBI contact in Albany, Special Agent Elise Harper, someone he'd worked with on narcotics raids years ago. She didn't hesitate. "I've been hearing whispers about something bigger," she told him. "Internal records showing odd transfers, suppressed complaints. Hall, I think you only saw the tip of it." She agreed to meet him 2 days later, in a diner just off Route 6. Ranger rode in the front seat, head sticking slightly out the window, sniffing the cold October air. The meeting was supposed to be simple, quiet. It wasn't. As Hall slid into the booth, Elise looked up and said one word, "Run." Hall barely had time to turn when the back window of the diner shattered. 2 men, ski masks, silenced weapons. The room exploded into chaos, customers screaming, glass shattering. Hall ducked behind the counter, pulling Ranger down with him. But the dog wriggled free, teeth bared. Ranger charged. One man went down screaming as Ranger locked on his forearm. The other raised his weapon. A single shot echoed through the diner. Elise fired from behind the jukebox. The second man fell. Silence. Ranger was bleeding. A graze across the side of his ribs. Not deep, but bloody. Hall crawled to him, cradling his partner, checking the wound. Ranger licked his face, tail wagging weakly. "Not today, bud," Hall whispered. "You're not leaving me today." The men were identified within 24 hours, ex-military contractors with ties to private security firms. One had been hired by a consulting company, later revealed to be laundering money for the same evidence. Ring Hall had exposed. The ring went deeper than the local station. It reached into federal contracts, political donors, a web too complex for local courts. This was no longer just about a corrupt precinct. This was about a system built on silence. The FBI opened a full-scale investigation. Hall agreed to testify in Washington. He entered temporary protective custody, not because he was afraid, but because he had more to say, and he wasn't done protecting Ranger either. Ranger received treatment at a canine trauma clinic and made a full recovery within 2 weeks. The vet called him a tank with a heart. When reporters asked if Ranger would retire after the injury, Hall smiled. "When he's ready," he said. "But I think he's got one more fight left in him." On Veterans Day, Ranger was invited to the Pentagon. He stood beside military, working dogs from combat zones across the globe. A general placed a medallion around his neck and knelt. "You saved more than one life, Ranger," he said. "You reminded this country that courage has 4 legs." Ranger barked once, a crisp, proud sound, and across America people watched with tears in their eyes. But late one night back home, Hall sat on his porch, sipping coffee, Ranger at his side. He stared into the trees. Somewhere out there, others were watching, waiting. Hall leaned down and scratched Ranger behind the ears. "If they come again," he whispered, "you have one job." Ranger looked up. "No barking this time," Hall said. "Go for the throat." Ranger didn't wag his tail. He just sat still, silent and ready, because loyalty never ends, and neither does the fight for truth. Winter came early that year in Brookwood. The first snowfall dusted the streets in silence, blanketing rooftops and muting the town's usual rhythms. But inside a modest home on Maplewood Lane there was no peace. Only preparation. Officer Thomas Hall zipped his field bag closed, slid a Glock into the side pouch, and ran his fingers through Ranger's thick fur one more time. "This is it, buddy," he murmured. "No backup. No margin for error." Ranger's ears perked at the tone, not fearful but focused. He knew that voice. It was the same voice Hall used just before every mission they'd ever done together. The FBI's investigation had stalled. Too many layers. Too many protected names. But one location kept popping up in the confidential files. A remote hunting lodge in Pennsylvania, leased under fake identities, shielded by shell companies. According to a source Elise Harper had flipped, it was being used as a meeting point for higher-ups in the smuggling operation. The same men who had ordered Hall's death. The same men who had sent 2 shooters into that diner weeks ago. No warrants, no search authorization, too many roadblocks. So Hall made a decision. If the system wouldn't protect the people, he would. One last mission. Off the record, just him. And Ranger. The drive took 4 hours through icy roads and backwoods trails. They arrived just after dusk, headlights off, tires crunching over frozen leaves. The lodge stood in the distance. 2 stories, windows dark, smoke rising faintly from a back chimney. Someone was home. Hall parked half a mile away. He clicked Ranger's vest into place and whispered, "Silent entry." Ranger moved like a shadow, his body low, paws careful. They circled the back, passing through thick brush until they reached a cellar door. Unlocked. Always a bad sign. Inside, the basement was half finished, filled with filing cabinets and crates of equipment. Hall's flashlight swept across cereal-labeled boxes, bundles of cash, sealed bags, evidence no court would ever admit had existed. But the real prize wasn't stuff. It was the laptop left open on the desk. An active screen, emails, ledger entries, names. Hall inserted a flash drive. Downloading. Then, footsteps. Upstairs. 2 voices. One familiar. He froze. It was Captain Darren Miles, Brookwood's former deputy chief. The same man who had delivered Hall's eulogy. The same man who had shaken his wife's hand and said he was one of the good ones. Hall shut the laptop lid. Too risky to keep copying. He pocketed the drive and signaled Ranger to stay back. Gun drawn, he crept up the stairs and reached the 2nd floor. Old carpet, peeling wallpaper, faint smell of cigar smoke. He saw Miles, in the sitting room sipping whiskey beside a bearded man in a leather jacket. "I'm telling you," Miles was saying. "He won't stop." "That damn dog won't stop either," the other man grunted. "Dogs can be replaced, men too." Hall stepped forward. "Let's test that theory." Both men jumped. Miles reached for his weapon, but Ranger had already launched. The other man tried to flee, but Hall tackled him to the floor, knocking the breath from his lungs. Chaos exploded in seconds. Gunfire, furniture crashing, shouts echoing through the walls. But Ranger never let go. He held Miles down by the arm until Hall cuffed him, blood dripping from the man's sleeve. They weren't going anywhere. By the time local police arrived, called anonymously from a nearby burner phone, Hall and Ranger were waiting on the porch. The flash drive had everything: financial records, phone logs, even photos of the fake funeral arrangements. It was enough to take down 5 high-level players across 3 states. Back in Brookwood, the fallout was swift. Miles was indicted. So was the man in the leather jacket, identified as a private contractor linked to offshore accounts. The department was gutted and rebuilt under new leadership. Hall declined every press interview. He said the only statement that mattered was the truth they found in that cabin. But even in victory, there was a weight he couldn't shake. Ranger had been injured in the struggle. Nothing life-threatening, just a torn ligament and some deep bruising, but it was enough for the department's vet to make a hard recommendation: retirement. Hall refused at first. Ranger still had that fire in him, that edge. But then came the morning when Ranger didn't jump up at the sound of Hall's keys, didn't pace at the door when Hall put on his boots. He just laid there, head down, watching. The look in his eyes said it all. "I've done enough." Hall signed the paperwork on a Monday. Ranger was officially retired with full honors and a lifetime pension, chew toys and all. The department threw a ceremony at City Hall. Kids brought homemade signs. A woman baked a cake shaped like a badge. A little boy handed Ranger a crayon drawing of him wearing a cape. "Because he's a superhero," the boy said. No one disagreed. But Hall knew Ranger didn't want capes or cakes. He just wanted to be near his partner. So they adjusted. Slower walks, shorter steps, more naps, and more stories. Hall began speaking at veteran events and police academies, always with Ranger beside him. He never told the full story, just the parts that mattered. "How do you know who to trust?" a cadet once asked him. Hall looked at Ranger. "You don't always," he said, "but if a dog barks at something even once, you listen." One morning, nearly a year later, Hall woke to silence. No paws on the floor, no tail thumping against the wall. He rushed to the living room. Ranger was lying by the fireplace, curled tight, breath slow. Hall knelt beside him, tears welling. "It's okay," he whispered. "You can rest now." Ranger blinked once, pressed his head into Hall's hand, then peacefully closed his eyes. The funeral was held privately. No flags, no rifles, no sirens. Just Hall, a folded vest and a collar engraved with one word, truth. He buried Ranger under the oak tree behind the house, planted lavender, built a wooden sign, "Here lies Ranger, a partner, a protector, a hero who never needed to speak to be heard." Weeks later, Hall received one final package from the FBI. Inside was a plaque, "For service beyond duty, K9 Ranger." Beneath it, a letter handwritten by Agent Harper. "Some dogs serve time, Ranger served justice." There's something different about a quiet house after a hero is gone. The floors still creak the same. The porch still groans under Hall's boots. The coffee pot still sputters every morning. But the silence? That's new. That's heavy. For Officer Thomas Hall, adjusting to life without Ranger was like learning to breathe with one lung. Everything worked. Just not the same. It had been 3 months since Ranger passed away peacefully beside the fireplace. The town of Brookwood had moved on, as towns do. Headlines had faded. Politicians had replaced promises with new ones. But in one corner of upstate New York, under the wide arms of a 100-year-old oak tree, the legacy of a German shepherd lived on. Hall visited that tree every morning. He didn't talk much. Sometimes he brought a fresh biscuit and left it by the marker. Other times he just sat with a thermos of coffee and let the wind do the talking. But grief has a strange way of bending into purpose, and Hall was far from done. The letters started arriving in early spring. At first they came from other K9 handlers. My partner was dismissed for false alerts. But after your story, we reopened the case. And he was right. Thanks. To Ranger, we listened when our K9 wouldn't leave a flood zone. We found a missing child hours before nightfall. Then came letters from children, drawings, stories, crayon-covered thank you notes with uneven block letters. I want to be brave like Ranger when I grow up. My dog barks at my brother's closet every night. We trust her more now. Hall smiled at everyone, because Ranger wasn't just a hero anymore. He was a symbol. That spring, Hall was invited to speak at the National K9 Conference in Austin, Texas. He almost turned it down. Too many reporters, too much attention, too many memories. But something told him to go. He packed Ranger's old vest, not as a prop, but as presence. And when he stepped on stage in front of 2,000 officers, handlers, veterans, and families, he didn't recite statistics or policy changes. He told the story of a funeral, of a bark, of a truth too powerful to stay buried. You want to know what makes a good cop? He asked the audience. It's not the badge, or the training, or the command. It's listening, especially when the one trying to tell you something doesn't have a voice. The room fell still. Hall held up Ranger's vest. This vest didn't make him a hero. His heart did. After the speech, dozens approached him. One was a young woman named Emily Torres, a 24-year-old rookie handler from Nevada. Her dog, Titan, had recently been flagged for behavioral issues. Too aggressive, too stubborn, not obedient enough. But after Ranger's story, she said, I realized he wasn't disobedient. He was trying to tell me something. She re-examined a case Titan had been obsessed with. An abandoned shed behind a storage facility. Officers had searched it twice. But, with Emily's insistence, they got a warrant to dig underneath. They found 5 crates of unregistered weapons buried beneath the floorboards. Titan was right, and Ranger had helped her believe it. Hall returned to Brookwood with a fire relit. He used the rest of his pension and a modest grant from the state to buy a rundown lot at the edge of town. 6 months later, the doors opened on the Ranger Institute for Working Dogs and Handlers. It wasn't just a training center. It was a philosophy. Listen to the dog. Trust the instincts. Never silence the bark. Veterans found purpose again through training programs. Rescued strays were paired with officers. Retired canines found forever homes on the property's 10-acre spread, and every new trainee had to learn Ranger's law. Never walk away from what your partner sees, even if no one else does. Hall didn't need medals. He didn't need parades. He just needed that tree, that vest, that memory. But fate wasn't finished with him yet. In the fall of the following year, a boy went missing just 3 blocks from the institute. His name was Caleb, 7 years old. Last seen chasing a stray puppy down an alley. Panic spread fast. The institute's current lead canine, Luna, a sleek black shepherd with amber eyes, was dispatched with Hall himself. The town held its breath. Hours passed. Then, Luna barked. And didn't stop. She led Hall to an old storm drain. Inside, the boy, cold, frightened, alive. When the boy was reunited with his parents, he clung to Luna like a lifeline, and when reporters asked Hall how they found him, he said, "The dog barked. I listened." Simple as that. And everyone who had followed Ranger's journey knew what that meant. Now, years later, Ranger's name still comes up in police briefings, documentaries, and canine training handbooks. The Brookwood Annual K9 Award is called the Ranger Honor. A statue of him, life-sized, eyes-focused, one paw lifted, is mounted outside the state K9 headquarters. Under it reads, "The bark that told the truth." As for Hall, he still lives in that small house with the oak tree. He still wakes early, still wears his old watch, still drives the same truck. And every morning he stops by the institute, walks past the trainees, and checks on the rookies. Sometimes, when Luna or one of the others barks at something no one else notices, he smiles quietly, because he's seen what happens when a dog barks and people choose not to listen. He's seen what almost got buried, and he knows what was saved. Thank you for following Ranger's story from beginning to end. In a world full of noise, it's easy to overlook the quiet warnings, the scratch at the door, the growl in the silence, the bark at a coffin. But sometimes, those are the voices that matter most. So we leave you with one question. If someone barked at the truth, would you have the courage to listen?